The dinner rush at the Gilded Plate was a symphony of clashing silverware and shouted orders, and Tessa Okafor was drowning. It was a Saturday night, and every table was a battlefield. Tessa's rent was 3 weeks overdue, her landlord's final eviction notice was taped to her fridge, and her sister back in Lagos was waiting for the medicine money Tessa had promised. Table 7 needs their wine, Okafor. Move it, or I'm docking your shift pay. Daniel Reeves, the floor manager, barked. He was a man who smelled of cheap cologne and enjoyed the petty power he held over immigrants like Tessa. Tessa didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. She moved with practiced grace, dodging impatient socialites, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She ducked into the dry storage room to grab a fresh stack of linen, but as the heavy door swung shut, the roar of the restaurant faded into a chilling silence. That's when she heard it. Not a clatter, but a small, hitched breath coming from the bottom cupboard, the one where they kept the industrial-sized flour bags. Tessa froze. She should leave. Table 7 was waiting. But the cupboard door creaked open an inch. She knelt on the cold concrete, her white apron blooming with grease stains. "Hello," she whispered. A pair of wide, terrified eyes stared back from the darkness. It was a boy no older than 5, curled into a ball behind the flour. He wore a miniature charcoal suit that cost more than Tessa's annual salary, but it was rumpled and dusty. "Hey there," Tessa said, her voice dropping into a soft, rhythmic lullaby tone. "Are you an explorer?" "This is a very dusty place for an adventure." The boy didn't move. He looked like a deer caught in headlights. Tessa reached into her pocket and pulled out a small container of jollof rice, her only meal for the next 12 hours, and held it out. The scent of ginger and spices filled the small space. "My name is Tessa," she said softly. "What's your name, little prince?" "Seo Jean," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Seo Jean. That's a strong name. Why are you hiding in a cupboard, sweetheart? Where's your papa?" Seo Jean's bottom lip wobbled. "The bad men, they were chasing the car. Uncle Jin told me to run into the lights and hide. He said don't come out until the man with the dragon ring finds me." Tessa's blood ran cold. Bad men? She didn't have time to process the fear before the cupboard door was kicked wide. "Okafor. I knew you were slacking." Daniel Reeves stood over them, his face a mask of purple-veined fury. He didn't even look at the terrified child. He only saw a reason to strike. "Theft of company food? Hiding a stray kid in my pantry? You've been looking for a reason to get fired, and here it is." "Daniel, look at him. He's terrified. He says people were chasing. I don't care if the devil himself is chasing him." Daniel snapped, reaching down to grab Tessa's arm. "You're done. Hand me your apron and get out of my restaurant before I call the police for kidnapping." Daniel shoved a crumpled termination paper into her hand, humiliating her in front of the kitchen staff. Tessa didn't cry. She stood up, took Seo Jean's small, shaking hand in hers, and walked out the service entrance with her head held high. They sat on the curb in the rain, Tessa wrapping her thin waitress sweater around the boy's shoulders. "It's okay, Seo Jean. We'll wait right here." A minute later, the street went silent. 3 matte black SUVs slammed to a screeching halt, boxing them in. Doors flew open, and men in dark suits with earpieces swarmed the sidewalk. Daniel Reeves stepped out of the restaurant, ready to shout at the illegal parking, but he froze when he saw the men. Then, the middle car opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, draped in a tailored overcoat that moved like shadows. He didn't look at the restaurant or the manager. His eyes, cold, sharp, and lethal, landed directly on Tessa and his son. On his right hand, a heavy gold ring featured a coiled dragon. Seo Jean let go of Tessa's hand and ran. "Appa." Han Junkyung caught his son, but his gaze never left Tessa. He saw her ruined uniform, the empty food container, and the way she stood between his son and the world. He looked at Daniel, who was now trembling. "You," Junkyung's voice was like sliding steel, addressing the manager. "You fired her for protecting my son?" Daniel began to stammer. I didn't know she was stealing." Junkyung didn't let him finish. He turned back to Tessa. "You sacrificed your livelihood for a child you didn't know. Most people in this city would have sold him. Why did you stay?" Tessa lifted her chin, meeting the gaze of the most dangerous man in the city. Because he was hungry. And because he was scared. Does a person need a better reason than that? Kyung felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: respect. The manager was right about one thing, he said, his voice dropping an octave. You are done at this restaurant. You work for me now. Tessa stood frozen as the weight of Daniel's words settled over her like a shroud. Around them, the high-octane energy of the gilded plate didn't stutter. Waiters swerved around the small group with silver platters, and the distant clink of crystal glasses continued, oblivious to the fact that her life was dismantling in the hallway. Daniel, please, Tessa whispered, Ed, her voice cracking as she felt Seo-jin's small fingers tighten their grip on her hand. He's just a little boy. He was hiding in a cupboard, terrified. I couldn't just leave him. And I can't leave a thief on my payroll, Daniel snapped. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper, a formal termination notice. He seemed to have ready for just such an occasion. He didn't hand it to her, he dropped it, watching it flutter onto the grease-stained floor near her worn shoes. You were hired to serve the people who pay for this atmosphere, not to run a daycare for strays out of my pantry. The humiliation was a physical heat rising in Tessa's chest. Several kitchen staff peered through the swinging doors, their faces a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them under Daniel's heel tonight. Tessa looked down at Seo-jin. The boy was staring at the paper on the floor, then up at Daniel with a look of pure, unadulterated fear. I'm not a stray, Seo-jin murmured, his voice barely audible over the roar of the industrial dishwasher. Shut it, kid, Daniel hissed. He turned his venom back to Tessa. Get your things and get out the back. If I see your face in the dining room, I'm calling security. And don't think about a reference. I'll make sure every manager in this city knows you'd rather feed a stranger than follow an order. Tessa felt the sting of tears, but she refused to let them fall, not in front of him. She reached down and slowly picked up the termination paper. It felt heavy, a death sentence for her dreams and a direct blow to the family back home who relied on her every cent. With trembling fingers, she untied her stained white apron and draped it over a nearby crate. She turned away from Daniel, focusing entirely on the small boy. Come on, Seo-jin, she said, her voice regaining a forced steadiness. Let's go. We don't belong here anyway. As she led him toward the service exit, the cold night air hit her face, a harsh reminder of the reality waiting outside. She had $43 in her pocket, no job, and a billionaire's son who was still looking for a man with a dragon ring. She sat on the damp curb under the flickering neon sign of the restaurant, wrapping her thin sweater around the shivering boy. She had lost everything in 10 minutes, yet as Seo-jin leaned his head against her shoulder, Tessa knew she couldn't have made any other choice. The gilded plate was behind her, but the shadow of the SUVs was already lengthening across the street. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long, sickly yellow shadows across the damp pavement as Tessa sat on the curb, shielding Seo-jin from the biting wind. The silence of the alley was absolute, broken only by the boy's shallow hiccups and the distant hum of the city. Tessa felt the heavy weight of the termination paper in her pocket, a physical reminder that she was now adrift. Yet, as she looked at the small boy huddled against her, her fear for her own future was eclipsed by a protective instinct she couldn't suppress. The silence was shattered by the screech of tires. 3 matte black SUVs rounded the corner with predatory speed, their headlights cutting through the gloom like searchlights. They slammed to a halt, boxing in the service entrance of the restaurant. Doors flew open in perfect unison, and men in dark, tailored suits swarmed the sidewalk, their earpieces glinting under the street lamps. Daniel Reeves stepped out from the service door, his face twisting into a mask of indignation. Hey, you can't park those, he stopped mid-sentence, the words dying in his throat as the middle SUV's rear door opened with a heavy, mechanical thud. A man stepped out into the rain. He didn't use an umbrella. He stood tall, draped in an overcoat that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. He moved with a terrifying, quiet grace that commanded the very air around him. As he turned, the light caught the heavy gold ring on his finger, a coiled dragon. Appa! Seo-jin cried out, his voice a mix of relief and lingering terror. He scrambled up from the curb and sprinted toward the man. Han Junkyung caught his son in one fluid motion, lifting him against his chest. His expression remained a mask of cold stone, but his hand cupped the back of the boy's head with a surprising, possessive tenderness. Over the boy's shoulder, Junkyung's eyes locked onto Tessa. They were the eyes of a man who saw everything and forgot nothing. "Is this the woman?" Junkyung's voice was a low, resonant rumble that made the hair on Tessa's neck stand up. "She helped me, Appa," Seo-jin sobbed into his father's neck. "She gave me her food." But the mean man yelled. He made her sad. Junkyung turned his gaze toward Daniel, who was now trembling so violently his teeth actually chattered. "You," the Mafia boss said, "the word a death sentence." "My son says you made her sad. My son says you punished her for his safety." I didn't know, Mr. Han. She was neglecting her tables, it's company policy." "Your policy is irrelevant," Junkyung interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more threat than a scream. He looked back at Tessa, who had stood up and was meeting his gaze with a weary, unyielding dignity. She didn't cower, she simply stood her ground, her ruined uniform a badge of honor in the rain. "You lost your livelihood for a stranger's child," Junkyung observed, his eyes tracing the exhaustion in her face. "Most would have looked away. Why didn't you?" "Because he's a child," Tessa replied, her voice clear and steady despite the chaos. "And no child should ever feel like the world has forgotten them." For a heartbeat, the mask of the billionaire Mafia boss flickered. He didn't smile, but the predatory edge in his eyes softened into something more complex: respect. "Get in the car, Miss Okafor," he commanded, gesturing to the open door. "The gilded plate no longer deserves your service. I, however, require it." The morning sun did nothing to warm the cramped, dimly lit studio apartment that had been Tessa's only sanctuary. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the eviction notice on the table and the termination slip beside it. The finality of the two papers felt like a pair of shears cutting the last threads of her life in this city. She had exactly $22 left after buying Seo-jin's food, and the silence of her dead phone was a haunting reminder that she was now truly invisible. A sharp, rhythmic knock at the door made her heart leap into her throat. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially not her landlord, who usually preferred to scream through the wood. When she opened it, she didn't find a disgruntled building manager. Instead, a man in a slate-gray suit stood in the hallway, his presence as polished and intimidating as a sharpened blade. "Miss Okafor," he said, his voice a low, neutral baritone. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning her meager belongings with a clinical detachment. "My name is Jin. I represent Mr. Han Junkyung." Tessa tightened the belt of her worn bathrobe, her Nigerian pride rising like a shield. "If you're here to give me money for yesterday, you can leave. I told your boss I don't sell my kindness." Jin didn't flinch. Instead, he placed a thick, vellum folder on her small kitchen table. "Mr. Han doesn't offer charity, Miss Okafor. He offers investments. My employer has a son who has not spoken a word to a stranger in 2 years, until he met you in a storage closet. He has a son who refuses to eat unless the food is seasoned the way you prepared it yesterday." He opened the folder, revealing a contract that looked more like a treaty than a job offer. Tessa's eyes blurred as she saw the numbers. The annual salary was more than she could have earned at the restaurant in a decade. It included a private suite at the Han estate, legal protection, and a clause that guaranteed the full funding of her sister's medical treatments in Lagos. "This is too much," Tessa whispered, her hand trembling as she reached for the paper. "Nobody gives this much for a nanny." "You aren't being hired as a nanny," Jin corrected, his gaze turning piercing. "You are being hired as his companion. You are the only person Seo-jin trusts. In Mr. Han's world, trust is the rarest and most expensive commodity there is." Tessa looked at the eviction notice, then back at the contract. It was a golden lifeline, but she could feel the weight of the hook hidden beneath the surface. To sign this was to enter a world of shadows, dragon rings, and secrets that could swallow her whole. "And if I refuse?" Jin gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of respect. "Then you stay here and wait for the locks to be changed." But Mr. Han is a man who gets what he wants, Miss Okafor. And right now, what he wants is the woman who wasn't afraid to look him in the eye. Tessa picked up the pen. She thought of Seo-jin's small hand in hers and the desperate medicine her sister needed. With a steady hand, she signed her name, knowing that while her poverty was over, her peace of mind was likely gone forever. The sleek black sedan glided through iron gates that looked more like the entrance to a fortress than a private residence. As they wound up the long, manicured driveway, the city of Chicago fell away, replaced by the oppressive silence of the Han estate. The house was a masterpiece of glass and cold stone, perched on a hill like a predator watching its territory. Tessa sat in the back seat, her fingers tracing the edge of the vellum contract in her lap. She had traded her stained waitress uniform for a simple, elegant dress provided by Jin, but she had never felt more like an intruder. When the car door opened, the air felt different here, thicker, charged with a tension that made the hair on her arms stand up. Jin led her through a foyer of soaring ceilings and white marble, where the only sound was the rhythmic click of their shoes. It was beautiful, yet there wasn't a single photograph on the walls, no straight toys, no signs of the warmth a 5-year-old boy should bring to a home. It was a museum built for a man who trusted no one. Miss Okafor has arrived, Jin announced as they entered a sprawling study. Han Junkyung was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, his back to them. He had shed his overcoat, revealing a tailored suit that moved like liquid silk. Even in repose, his silhouette radiated a terrifying gravity. He didn't turn around immediately, and in the silence, Tessa's eyes wandered to his desk. Among the high-tech monitors and leather-bound ledgers lay a heavy, blackened handgun and a burner phone that buzzed incessantly. The sight sent a jolt of ice through her veins. This wasn't just the office of a billionaire, it was a war room. "You're late," Junkyung said, finally turning. His gaze swept over her, sharp and calculating. "The bus system doesn't cater to fortresses," Tessa replied, her Nigerian accent thickening as she leaned into her defiance to hide her nerves. A ghost of a smirk touched his lips. "In this house, we do not rely on the systems of others. You will learn that soon enough." He stepped closer, the gold dragon ring on his hand catching the light. "My son is in the North Wing. He has refused to leave his room since the incident at the restaurant. He is waiting for the woman with the rice." As Tessa walked toward the hallway, she passed a half-open door where 2 men stood guard, their jackets bulging with the unmistakable shape of holstered weapons. She realized then that the gilded cage wasn't just a metaphor. Junkyung wasn't protecting his son from the world. He was protecting him from a shadow world she was only beginning to glimpse. She had signed for a salary, but as she looked back at Junkyung's cold, unreadable face, she realized she had walked into a den of lions. She wasn't just a companion anymore, she was a witness to secrets that people killed to keep. The north wing of the estate was a labyrinth of silence until Tessa reached the heavy oak door of Seo-jin's playroom. Inside, the boy sat cross-legged on a plush rug, surrounded by a small army of expensive, motionless plastic knights. Across from him sat Junkyung, perched stiffly on a miniature chair that looked absurd beneath his imposing frame. He was staring at a toy castle as if it were a tactical map for a hostile takeover, his face set in a mask of grim concentration. "You are supposed to move the cavalry to the flank," Seo-jin, Junkyung said, his voice as formal as if he were addressing a board of directors. "That is the logical progression." Seo-jin's shoulders slumped, his small hand hovering uncertainly over a dragon. Tessa leaned against the doorframe, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "Logic is for the office, Mr. Han. In here, the dragons decide the rules." Junkyung looked up, his sharp gaze softening almost imperceptibly at the sight of her. "The boy needs to understand strategy. The world does not play by imaginary rules." "The world can wait," Tessa countered, stepping into the room and sinking onto the rug beside Seo-jin. She picked up a stray knight and made a loud, ridiculous clashing sound against a plastic shield. Seo-jin's eyes widened, a tiny spark of light returning to them. "The Blue Knight isn't thinking about flanks, Mr. Han. He's thinking about how much he wants a slice of cake." Seo-jin let out a small, breathless giggle, the first real sound of joy Tessa had heard in this house. Kyung watched them, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. I don't understand. How does that help him learn? It's not about learning. It's about being together, Tessa said, her voice dropping to a gentle, encouraging tone. She reached out and placed a small plastic dragon in Kyung's hand. The gold of his dragon ring glittered against the green scales of the toy. Try it. Make the dragon roar. Forget the strategy. Just play. Kyung stared at the toy in his palm as if it were a live grenade. He looked at his son, who was watching him with a hopeful, desperate intensity. Slowly, the billionaire Mafia boss leaned forward. He didn't roar, not at first, but he moved the dragon toward the castle with a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in the quiet room. Seojin's face lit up like a sunrise. He surged forward, his own knights attacking his father's dragon with frantic, happy energy. For the next hour, the oppressive tension of the estate vanished. Tessa guided them, turning the floor into a battlefield of nonsense and laughter. She watched the way Kyung's shoulders finally dropped, the way his sharp eyes crinkled at the corners as he tried to mimic the sound of a falling bridge. In that moment, the dragon was gone, replaced by a father who was finally learning how to speak his son's language. As Kyung caught Tessa's eye over the pile of plastic toys, the air between them shifted. It wasn't just Seojin who was thawing. The ice around Kyung's heart was beginning to crack, and for the first time, the billionaire looked less like a king and more like a man who has realized what he had been missing. The transition from the warmth of the playroom to the cold splendor of the Metropolitan Gala was jarring. Tessa stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, her reflection unfamiliar in a gown of deep emerald silk that clung to her curves like a second skin. It was a gift from Kyung, along with the gold-threaded wrap that covered the faint scars of a life spent working twice as hard for half as much. She looked like a queen, but as she took Seojin's hand, his small tuxedo a mirror image of his father's, she felt more like a decoy. The ballroom was a sea of glittering diamonds and sharp smiles, but the air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with high society. Kyung moved through the crowd like a shark through a reef, his presence parting the guests in a wave of silent reverence and palpable fear. He kept Tessa and Seojin close to his side, his hand frequently resting on the small of her back. To the outside world, they were the picture of a powerful man's hidden soft side, the beautiful, nurturing woman and the protected heir. Stay close, Kyung murmured, his voice a low vibration near her ear. His eyes weren't on the champagne, they were scanning the balconies and the doorways with a predatory focus. The illusion of a fairy tale shattered near the terrace. A man with a jagged scar across his cheek approached, his smile not reaching his eyes. As he leaned in to speak to Kyung, Tessa caught the flash of a weapon tucked into his waistband and the way Kyung's posture shifted from father to executioner. The conversation was conducted in low, jagged whispers, but the word territory hissed through the air like a snake. Tessa realized then with a sickening jolt that her presence wasn't just about Seojin's happiness. Every time Kyung leaned down to whisper a joke to his son, or leaned in toward Tessa with a practiced look of affection, the men in the room softened their stance. She was his human shield, the kind face that sanitized his image and signaled to his enemies that he had something to lose, or perhaps, something to hide behind. She looked down at Seojin, who was clinging to her hand, oblivious to the wolf in his father's eyes. The emerald dress suddenly felt like a weight of lead. She had thought she was thawing a dragon, but as she watched Kyung offer a cold, lethal nod to the scarred man, she realized she was merely decorating his cave. The money, the medical care for her sister, the luxury, it was all a gilded payment for a role she hadn't realized she was playing. She wasn't just a companion, she was the camouflage for a world built on blood, and for the first time, the heat of Kyung's hand on her back felt less like a caress and more like a brand. The emerald dress lay in a heap on the marble floor of her suite, a discarded skin that no longer fit the woman Tessa needed to be. In the silence of the night, the estate felt less like a palace and more like a tomb. She moved with a quiet, desperate efficiency, packing the same small duffel bag she had arrived with. She took nothing that Junkyung had bought her, no silk, no jewelry, not a single cent of the blood-stained allowance that sat in her bedside drawer. She made her way to the north wing one last time. Seojin was asleep, his chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm she had fought so hard to give him. Tessa knelt by his bed, her heart breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. She whispered a prayer for his protection, a silent promise that she wasn't leaving him, but leaving the monster his father chose to be. She left a single toy knight on his nightstand, the one Junkyung had learned to roar with, and a note that simply said, "Be brave, little prince." As she reached the heavy oak doors of the study, she found Junkyung staring at a security monitor, his face cast in the blue light of a dozen cameras. He didn't turn around, but the air in the room thickened. "The gates are locked, Tessa," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Then unlock them," Tessa replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her soul. "I can't do this, Junkyung. I thought I was helping you find your heart, but I was just helping you hide the fact that you've traded it for power. I won't be the beautiful distraction while you destroy people's lives." Junkyung turned, his eyes flashing with a mixture of fury and a sudden, raw vulnerability. "I gave you everything. Security. Wealth. Your sister's life. You gave me a cage," she countered, stepping closer into the light. "My sister would rather die than know her medicine was bought with the tears of other families. You say you love Seojin, but you're raising him to be a king of a graveyard. I'm done." She pulled the signed contract from her bag and tore it down the middle, letting the vellum pieces fall like snow onto his desk, right next to the blackened handgun. For a long moment, the silence was a physical weight. Junkyung's hand went to his dragon ring, his knuckles white. He could stop her. He could lock her in a room and never let the world see her again. "Let me go," she whispered. "If there is a single shred of the man who played dragons with his son left in you, let me go." Junkyung's jaw tightened, his gaze searching hers for a weakness he could exploit, but finding only the same unyielding dignity that had drawn him to her in the first place. With a sharp, jagged breath, he hit a button on his desk. The heavy iron gates at the end of the drive began to groan open. Tessa didn't wait for him to change his mind. She walked out of the fortress, through the rain that felt like a baptism, and disappeared into the shadows of the city. She had no job and no home, but as the gates clicked shut behind her, she breathed the air of a woman who was finally, and truly, free. The silence that followed Tessa's departure was not quiet, it was deafening. It settled into the marrow of the Han estate, turning the sprawling mansion back into the mausoleum it had been before she arrived. Junkyung stood in the center of the north wing, surrounded by the plastic knights and dragons that now seemed like relics of a lost civilization. He had expected to feel the familiar surge of cold control that usually came with removing a liability, but instead, he felt a hollow ache in his chest that no amount of power could fill. Seojin had stopped speaking. The boy didn't cry or throw tantrums. He simply retreated into a shell so thick that even Junkyung's most desperate commands couldn't reach him. He sat by the window, staring at the iron gates, holding the toy knight Tessa had left behind as if it were a holy relic. When the private chefs brought in his favorite meals, he pushed them away. When the tutors tried to engage him, he looked through them. "He is fading, sir," Jin whispered one evening, standing in the doorway of Junkyung's study. "The doctors say it's psychological, but we know what it is. It's heartbreak." Junkyung looked at the monitors on his desk. His empire was at its peak. He had just crushed a rival family's attempt to seize the docks, and his bank accounts were overflowing. But as he looked at the grainy footage of his son, small, pale, and motionless, he realized the price of his soul was being paid by the only person he actually loved. Tessa's words echoed in the room, louder than the buzzing of his burner phones. "You're raising him to be a king of a graveyard." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city he had conquered. To keep his power, he had to remain a monster. To save his son, he had to become a man. The crossroads was sharp and jagged. If he stepped down, if he dismantled the machinery of violence he had spent a lifetime building, his enemies would see it as a weakness. He would lose his crown, his safety, and his shadow throne. But then he remembered the sound of Seo Jin's laughter during the dragon game. He remembered the steady, unafraid gaze of the woman who had sacrificed everything for a child that wasn't hers. Jun Kyung said, his voice cracking for the first time in 20 years. Begin the liquidation of the offshore assets. Contact the authorities regarding the dock records. We're burning it all down. Jin's eyes widened. Sir, if you go through with this, there's no coming back. You'll be just a man. Jun Kyung turned, the gold dragon ring glinting one last time before he pulled it from his finger and dropped it onto the desk. Good, he said, the weight finally lifting from his shoulders. I think it's time I learned how to be one. The neighborhood was a far cry from the glass and steel fortresses of the city center. Here, the air smelled of laundry detergent and street food, and the buildings wore their age with a tired, honest dignity. Tessa spent her days at the community center, teaching English to new immigrants and helping mothers navigate the very systems that had once tried to swallow her whole. She had no security detail, no silk gowns, and very little in her bank account, but when she closed her eyes at night, her soul was quiet. She was organizing a stack of donated books when the room suddenly went still. It wasn't a loud noise that changed the atmosphere, but a sudden, heavy shift in the air, a gravity she had only ever felt in one place. Tessa didn't turn around immediately. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of hope and old fear. I heard the center was looking for a literacy advocate, a voice said. It was lower than she remembered, stripped of its lethal edge, replaced by a raw, human exhaustion. Tessa turned. Jun Kyung stood in the doorway, framed by the peeling paint of the community hall. He wasn't wearing a tailored Italian suit. He was in a simple navy sweater and dark jeans, his hands buried in his pockets. He looked smaller, somehow less like a god of the underworld and more like a man who had walked a very long way to find what he was looking for. The gates were left open, Tessa, he said softly, echoing her final words to him. She looked at his hands. The gold dragon ring was gone, leaving only a pale band of skin where it had sat for 2 decades. I heard the news, she whispered, her voice trembling. The docks. The offshore accounts. People are saying the Han Empire vanished overnight. It didn't vanish, Jun Kyung corrected, stepping into the room. I dismantled it. Every stone, every bloodstained scent. I'm an ordinary citizen now. There are investigations, and there will be trials, but I am free. And more importantly, Seo Jin is free. At the mention of the boy, a small figure darted from behind Jun Kyung. Seo Jin didn't hesitate this time. He launched himself across the room, his small arms wrapping around Tessa's waist with a strength that nearly knocked her over. Tessa, I brought the blue knight. He held up the toy, his face bright with the kind of light that only comes from a heart that has been mended. Tessa sank to her knees, hugging the boy tight, her tears finally falling. Over his head, she looked at Jun Kyung. He didn't offer her a contract or a gilded cage. He simply offered his hand. I don't have a kingdom anymore, he said, his eyes searching hers with a vulnerability that was finally real. Just a son who loves you and a man who wants to learn how to be worthy of that love. Is there room for us here? Tessa took his hand, her fingers interlocking with his. The skin was rougher than she remembered, the grip more honest. There's plenty of room, she said, pulling them both into the warmth of the center. In this kingdom, we start with the truth.